Settle in near the fire for a while. Tonight, we're going to follow a different trail through Red Dead Redemption 2. The question is simple at first, but it opens like a valley after rain. What if Arthur Morgan, not Dutch van der Linde, became the true leader of the gang? Not the loudest dreamer, not the man with the grandest speeches, not the voice promising Tahiti, mangoes and one last score, but Arthur, the man who knows who needs medicine, who can track in snow, who can tell when a job smells wrong, and who has spent most of his life carrying other people's consequences on his back. This is not a version where Arthur wakes up one morning hungry for power. That would not feel like Arthur. He is too loyal, too tired, too suspicious of vanity, and too used to seeing himself as the man who does what must be done, rather than the man who tells everyone why it matters. The stronger version is quieter. After Blackwater, the gang is wounded, freezing, broke and frightened. Dutch is still the founder, still the voice, still the father in many minds, but something has cracked. The ferry job has gone wrong. Heidi McCourt is dead. The Blackwater money is gone. John is missing in the snow. Davy and Jenny are dying, or already gone. And in that terrible white silence, the person people begin looking toward is not the one making promises. It is the one finding food, making decisions, riding out into the storm, and coming back with someone alive. Arthur's leadership would begin almost by accident, because that is how real authority often begins in Red Dead Redemption 2. Dutch has formal command, Hosea has wisdom, Susan Grimshaw has discipline, Pearson keeps the belly of the camp from collapsing, and Charles brings calm competence into every bad situation. But Arthur is already the person most people trust when a problem has to be carried through danger. He is the one sent after John. He is the one who can speak to Hosea like a son, but argue like a grown man. He is the one the younger men admire, the women trust in emergencies, and the frightened depend on when things stop being theoretical. If the gang had been honest about where authority actually lived, Arthur was already more than Dutch's enforcer. He was the camp's spine. The first great change happens in Coulter, because snow reveals the difference between romance and leadership. Dutch can talk about faith, loyalty and endurance, but Arthur would measure leadership in blankets, meat, ammunition, and who can still ride by morning. Under Arthur, the first days after Blackwater would feel less like a wounded king trying to preserve his myth, and more like a field hospital trying to survive a storm. He would still respect Dutch. He would still listen to Hosea. He might even insist Dutch keep people's spirits from collapsing, because Dutch's gift for language is real. But Arthur would place survival above pride. He would ask Charles where game might still move in the weather. He would make Javier rest before sending him out too far. He would keep Micah close enough to watch. And when Dutch wanted to turn every hardship into proof that the world was against them, Arthur would keep dragging the thought back to firewood. That sounds small, but in this gang, small practical things are destiny. The van der Linde gang does not fall because one bad job goes wrong. It falls because bad jobs become stories Dutch cannot stop telling himself. Blackwater becomes proof that everyone must trust him more. Cornwall becomes proof that the rich deserve to be struck. Bronte becomes proof that Dutch can outplay civilization. The army becomes proof that chaos can be used as cover. Arthur, as leader, would still be an outlaw. He would still rob, threaten, shoot and lie, but he would be less likely to turn each wound into a sermon. He would feel guilt as weight rather than insult. That difference alone changes the road. The rescue of John would become the first quiet sign of Arthur's rule. In the original story, Arthur and Javier ride into the blizzard and bring John back half dead from the wolves. That would still happen. because Arthur's irritation with John never cancels the deeper bond. But if Arthur is leader, the meaning shifts. He is not rescuing John because Dutch's family must be kept whole as an extension of Dutch's dream. He is rescuing John because Abigail is scared, because Jack needs his father if that father can be made to remember what fatherhood means, and because leaving a man out there when he might still be alive is a line Arthur cannot cross. He would grumble the whole way. He would curse John for being careless. But when he came back with John on the horse, half frozen and bleeding, the camp would understand something important. Their new centre was not made of speeches. It was made of return. Sadie Adler's introduction would also change under Arthur's leadership, though not in an obvious sentimental way. The gang still finds the Adler ranch after the O'Driscolls have destroyed it. Sadie is still traumatised, furious, newly widowed, and half buried under shock. Dutch, in the original shape of the story, folds her into his grand idea of family almost by instinct. Arthur would be rougher on the surface and probably kinder underneath. He would not know what to say to her. He would not dress her grief in pretty language. But he would let her be useful when she was ready, and that matters. Arthur understands people who cannot speak their pain cleanly. He might ask Susan to keep an eye on her, ask Pearson not to treat her like helpless cargo, and ask Charles to give her space, without abandoning her. Sadie's fire would not be mistaken for madness quite as easily. Under Arthur, it might become responsibility earlier. Micah is the first true test. Any version where Arthur leads has to deal with Micah quickly, because Micah Bell is not merely a dangerous man. He is a chemical reaction. He changes the air around whoever stands near him. He flatters Dutch because Dutch wants to be admired. He attacks Arthur because Arthur sees through him. He encourages violence because violence creates confusion, and confusion is where Micah survives. If Arthur has command after Blackwater, Micah loses his easiest path to power. He cannot climb through Dutch's ego in the same way. He cannot whisper that Arthur lacks faith. Because Arthur's authority is not based on faith, it is based on whether the camp lives through the week. Arthur would not necessarily kill Micah in Coulter. That might sound tempting, but it would be too clean and too far from the gang's complicated loyalty. Micah is still a gun hand. He still survived the ferry disaster. He still knows parts of what happened. Dutch may still protect him, partly from stubbornness, and partly because Dutch cannot admit so early that bringing Micah close was a mistake. Hosea would warn Arthur not to create a public split in the middle of a blizzard, so Arthur's choice would likely be containment. Micah gets no private influence. Micah rides with men who can watch him. Micah is not allowed to decide routes, choose jobs, or speak for the camp. If he complains, Arthur says something short and final. If Dutch objects, Arthur does not humiliate him. He simply makes clear that Blackwater bought Micah no trust. Then comes the first enormous fork in the story, the Cornwall train. In the original chain of events, robbing Leviticus Cornwall's train gives the gang money and supplies, but it also paints a target on them so bright that Cornwall's private power and the Pinkertons begin pressing harder. It is one of those jobs that seems practical in the moment and ruinous in the long run. Dutch wants it because it looks like striking back at a rich man. Arthur, if he is leading, would see both sides. The gang is starving, the train is loaded, the O'Driscoll information gives them an opening. But Arthur is also more likely to listen when Hosea says attention is poison. A careful Arthur might still rob the train, but he would change the purpose. He would not treat it as an ideological statement against Cornwall. He would treat it as a cold-weather survival job, done cleanly, with less theatrics, less lingering, and a stronger plan to avoid being identified. He might forbid unnecessary killing, not out of saintliness, but because bodies create witnesses and vengeance. He might take bonds and supplies while leaving less personal insult behind. That would not make Cornwall forget. Men like Cornwall do not need much excuse to protect their money. But the tone of the job matters. Under Dutch, the robbery becomes part of a swelling war against power. Under Arthur, it becomes a risky theft that should be followed by disappearance, silence, and no more poking the same hornet's nest. Once the gang reaches Horseshoe Overlook, Arthur's leadership would become more visible, because peace gives people time to notice structure. Horseshoe is the camp where the gang almost feels alive in the old way. The cliffs look out over the valley. Valentine sits nearby, muddy and loud. People can hunt, work, drink, argue, sing, and pretend the worst has passed. Dutch uses places like this to restore belief. Arthur would use it to restore function. He would want money counted honestly. He would want fewer drunken rides into town. He would want jobs chosen for low heat instead of big reputation. He would still laugh with Lenny. He would still needle Uncle. He would still get dragged into foolishness now and then, because Arthur is not a machine. But the camp's centre of gravity would move from dreaming to planning. Hosea becomes more important in this version, not less. If Arthur leads, Hosea no longer has to spend all his energy softening Dutch's vanity. He can become what he always should have been, the strategist who says no before a bad plan becomes a disaster. Arthur trusts Hosea in a practical way. He may grumble, push back, and insist that a thing can be done, but he does not need Hosea's disagreement to feel like betrayal. That one emotional difference could save lives. Dutch increasingly hears caution as disloyalty, because caution threatens the grand story he tells about himself. Arthur hears caution as irritation, maybe, but also as information. He has spent enough years in the saddle to know the difference between fear and sense. Susan Grimshaw would also gain strength under Arthur. She already runs much of the camp's daily order. Dutch may inspire the idea of family, but Susan makes family get up, work, clean, cook, guard, and stop falling apart. Arthur respects that even when he complains about it. A camp under Arthur would likely become less theatrical, but more disciplined. People who do not contribute would hear about it. Strauss would find less protection for the ugliest parts of his lending. Reverend Swanson would still struggle, but Arthur might move him away from jobs that humiliate him. Tilly, Mary Beth, Karen, and Abigail would not suddenly live in paradise, but they would have a leader less interested in being adored, and more aware of the work they already do. Strauss is a major moral test. The debt collection that leads Arthur to Thomas Downs is one of the hinge points of his entire life. If Arthur is leader, the Strauss question has to be faced earlier. Dutch tolerates Strauss because the lending brings money, and because Dutch can keep his own hands clean while pretending the work is necessary. Arthur does the ugly collecting, hates pieces of it, and keeps going because the gang needs income. But a leader cannot hide from the nature of the money as easily. If Arthur has to answer directly for camp income, he may begin noticing that Strauss's business attacks the kind of desperate people the gang claims to protect. He may still allow some loans at first, because Arthur is not yet redeemed and not yet gentle, but he would be more likely to restrict the worst collections, especially once he sees sickness, poverty, and families caught in the teeth of it. The Downs Ranch could change the entire story. There are several possible branches, and the most honest version is not the easiest one. Arthur might still go to collect, because early Arthur is still harsh, still capable of cruelty, still willing to scare weak people when the gang needs money. Leadership does not instantly make him morally clean, but if he has been carrying responsibility for the camp more openly, the encounter might strike him differently. Beating a sick farmer for Strauss's ledger is more than another unpleasant job. It is now an image of what his leadership is funding. He might stop sooner. He might take less. He might return angry at Strauss, rather than simply angry at the world. The tuberculosis question could still happen, because tragedy in Red Dead often comes from one breath too many in the wrong room. But even if Arthur is infected, the meaning changes. His illness becomes tied not to blind loyalty to Dutch's system, but to the cost of becoming a leader before becoming a better man. Valentin's disaster with Cornwall would likely be smaller or delayed. In the original story, Cornwall confronts Dutch in town after the train robbery, and the gang's presence becomes too hot to ignore. Under Arthur, the gang would be more careful about who goes where, how often they drink, and how much noise they make. Lenny and Arthur's drunken night might still happen, because some pieces of joy deserve to survive even in a different version. But Arthur as leader would be less tolerant of men swaggering through town as if the law were asleep. Bill would be watched. Micah would not be allowed to turn Strawberry into a massacre without consequences. Sean would be celebrated, but the party would not become proof that trouble was gone. Horseshoe could last longer, and those extra weeks might matter more than any single robbery. Micah and Strawberry is another critical point. In the original story, Arthur breaks Micah out of jail, and the escape becomes a bloodbath. It is one of the clearest early warnings that Micah brings chaos wherever he goes. If Arthur leads, he may not rescue Micah at all, or he may rescue him under conditions so strict that Micah's pride cannot stand them. The most likely Arthur choice is practical. If Micah knows too much and his hanging could expose the gang, he cannot simply be left to talk. But Arthur would not stroll into town as Dutch's errand boy. He would plan it with Charles or Hosea, choose timing carefully, and prioritise silence. If Micah turns the escape into slaughter anyway, Arthur's patience would end. A man who cannot be retrieved without killing half a town is not an asset. He is a disease with a gun. Would Arthur execute Micah after Strawberry? Perhaps not immediately, but he would exile him if the camp could survive the risk. Arthur's leadership style would be hard on men who create heat for pleasure. Dutch keeps Micah close because Micah feeds the part of Dutch that wants every doubt to be someone else's weakness. Arthur has no such appetite. He might give Micah one warning, maybe because Dutch insists, maybe because the gang is short of shooters, but after Strawberry, Micah's freedom inside the camp would be over. He would sleep outside the real circle. He would not sit beside Dutch whispering poison. He would not become the alternate son. That alone bends the whole future. John's place in the gang would also change. Arthur begins the story angry at John for leaving Abigail and Jack, and that anger is not fake. It comes from old hurt, jealousy, disappointment, and the strange pain of watching another man have the family Arthur lost. But Arthur as leader would have to deal with John less like a younger brother he resents, and more like a man whose choices affect a child. He would still snap at him, he would still call him a fool. Yet, he might push John earlier toward actual responsibility, not with Dutch's sentimental talk of family, but with blunt pressure. You got a boy. You got Abigail. Stop drifting like you are the only one paying for it. That kind of leadership might irritate John enough to make him grow sooner. Abigail would see the difference before many others. Abigail is one of the clearest readers of the gang because she has no patience left for romance when Jack is at risk. Dutch's words may have once meant safety, but by 1899 she senses their hollowness earlier than most. Arthur leading would not remove danger from her life, but it would give her a person in power who actually hears the fear underneath her anger. Arthur knows what it means to lose a child, even if he rarely speaks of Isaac. That old grief would make him less dismissive of Abigail's panic. He might not know how to comfort her, but he would understand the stakes. Under Arthur, Jack is not camp decoration. He is the measuring stick for whether the gang deserves to keep calling itself a family. The move away from Horseshoe would still come eventually, because the West is closing in and the gang's existence is unsustainable. Pinkertons, Cornwall, local law, bounty hunters, old enemies, and their own habits all make stillness dangerous. But Arthur would be more likely to move because staying is tactically foolish, not because a dramatic confrontation has forced his hand. He might choose a quieter relocation, perhaps avoiding some of the showy entanglements that lead them into Lemoyne's old blood. He would listen when Hosea warns that the South has its own rot, its own families, its own grudges, and its own ways of swallowing outsiders. Clement's Point might still happen, but the plan there would be more cautious from the start. The Grey and Braithwaite feud is where Dutch's appetite for cleverness becomes deadly. The gang enters a conflict older than them, tries to play both sides, and eventually pays for it through Sean's death and Jack's kidnapping. Arthur as leader would be suspicious of the whole arrangement earlier. He is capable of manipulation, but he is not as intoxicated by it. Dutch loves the feeling of being the smartest man in a room full of corrupt aristocrats. Arthur would see old rich families, armed men, and too many moving pieces. Hosea's con work with the Braithwaites might still tempt the gang, because there is money there, and because Hosea is good at reading greed. But Arthur would likely set harder limits: no wearing deputy badges for fun, no deep partnership with both families, no pretending a local blood feud can be milked forever without turning back on them. Sean Maguire might live in this version. That is one of the first major emotional consequences. Sean dies in Rhodes because the gang becomes too confident in a place where they have misread the danger. If Arthur limits the feud games, the Rhodes ambush may never happen in the same way. Sean remains loud, foolish, charming, and alive. His survival changes camp morale, especially for Karen, who loses a piece of herself after him. It also preserves a spark the gang badly needs. Under Dutch, the young men are often used as fuel for momentum. Under Arthur, Sean might still get himself into trouble, but leadership would be more careful about letting excitement masquerade as strategy. Jack's kidnapping is harder to avoid completely, because the Braithwaites and Bronte connection may still emerge if the gang touches that world at all. But Arthur as leader would react differently to the warning signs. The moment Jack disappears, Arthur's leadership becomes pure fire. He would not need Dutch to transform the rescue into a grand act of vengeance. He would gather the right people, strike Braithwaite Manor, and recover the boy. The manor might still burn, because grief and anger can make even careful men terrible. But afterward, Arthur would measure the cost. Dutch uses moments like that to deepen the myth of the gang as righteous avengers. Arthur would see a child returned, a house destroyed, enemies made, and the need to leave before vengeance becomes a trap. Angelo Bronte is perhaps the most important test of whether Arthur can resist Dutch's downfall. Bronte represents the city version of power, polished, amused, wealthy, connected, and cruel beneath the manners. Dutch hates him, partly because Bronte humiliates him. Arthur would dislike Bronte too, but with less wounded vanity. That matters. In the original story, Bronte manipulates the gang, sets them up, and Dutch eventually drowns him, then feeds him to an alligator in a moment that deeply unsettles Arthur and John. If Arthur leads, Bronte is dangerous, but he is not a mirror Arthur needs to smash. Arthur might rob him, threaten him, or avoid him. He might even kill him, if the situation demands it, but he would not need the theatrical brutality of revenge to prove his own importance. St. Denis would still frighten Arthur. That city is everything the gang cannot understand quickly enough. Police, banks, factories, mansions, streetcars, immigrant neighbourhoods, political machines, organised crime, and old money pretending to be new civilization. Dutch tries to treat St. Denis like another stage for his will. Arthur would treat it like hostile terrain. He is not stupid. He knows how out of place he is. He can feel the city pressing against the gang like a machine with too many gears. Under his leadership, the gang might use St. Denis carefully, but it would not camp its whole future on a fantasy of robbing civilization at its centre and walking away clean. The trolley station job probably never happens, or at least not in the same reckless way. In the original chain, Bronte's information leads the gang into a trap, and the failed trolley robbery becomes one more pressure point driving Dutch toward rage. Arthur would distrust a gift from Bronte. Hosea would distrust it too. A leader who listens to Hosea might send scouts, verify police movement, and decide that any job handed over by a crime lord is bait until proven otherwise. Without the trolley disaster, Dutch does not suffer that same blow to his pride. Lenny is not pulled through another needless danger, and the gang has less reason to escalate toward the St. Denis Bank too quickly. The St. Denis Bank robbery is where the original story breaks its own back. Hosea dies, Lenny dies, John is captured, the survivors flee to Guarma, Dutch loses his oldest counterweight. Arthur comes back to a camp already sliding toward suspicion and despair. Under Arthur, the bank robbery is the job most likely to be refused, delayed, or reshaped beyond recognition. Arthur may be desperate for money, but he understands heat better than Dutch does by this point. Hosea might find the lead, but he would also understand the risk. A bank in St. Denis is not a stagecoach on a lonely road. It is a strike against a modern city built to respond. If Arthur refuses the bank, the gang's future becomes less explosive but more uncertain. They still need money. They still cannot live forever in Lemoyne. The Blackwater stash is still unreachable. The Pinkertons still know too much. But avoiding the St. Denis Bank preserves Hosea and Lenny, and that changes everything. Hosea alive means Dutch cannot isolate the camp's imagination so easily. Lenny alive means the younger future of the gang is not cut down on a rooftop. John free means Abigail's panic does not become helpless fury. Guarma may never happen, which means Dutch never gets the same island crucible where violence and paranoia harden further. Sometimes the most important event in a counterfactual is the disaster that never receives its dramatic scene. Without Guarma, Dutch's collapse would be slower and more visible. That might sound safer, but it creates another kind of danger. Dutch would still resent Arthur's authority. A man who built a family around his own voice cannot easily become an advisor beside the son he raised. At first, Dutch might pretend to support Arthur for the good of the gang. He might call Arthur brave, practical, a man he trusts with his life. But every choice Arthur makes without needing Dutch's poetry would cut him. Every time Hosea agrees with Arthur, Dutch would feel replaced. Every time camp morale improves because fewer people are dying, Dutch would feel the terrible insult of being proven unnecessary. That emotional pressure could split the gang earlier. Some members would follow Arthur because he keeps them alive. Charles would respect him. Sadie would trust him after seeing how he treats grief and usefulness. Abigail would see Jack's safety taken seriously. John would resist, and then slowly understand. Hosea and Susan would hold the structure. Lenny would appreciate a leader who does not waste clever young men for dramatic plans. Tilly and Mary Beth would likely feel the camp growing less feverish. Pearson, Uncle and Swanson would go where the camp still feels like camp. But Bill and Javier are more complicated. Bill wants certainty, belonging, and a strong voice telling him where to stand. Javier believes in loyalty, ideals, and the old romance of Dutch's revolution. Dutch could still pull them away if he frames Arthur's caution as surrender. Micah would search for that crack. If Arthur has contained him, Micah's route to power is narrower, but not gone. He could whisper to Dutch that Arthur is turning the gang soft. He could tell Bill that Arthur does not respect him. He could tell Javier that the old dream is being buried by fear. He could tell anyone who feels displaced that Arthur has become a camp boss instead of a brother. Micah's genius is not intelligence in the noble sense, it is appetite for weakness. He can smell resentment. In this version, he would attach himself to Dutch's wounded pride and try to build a rival camp inside the camp. Arthur's answer to that threat would reveal the limits of his leadership. He is good at seeing through Micah, but he is not naturally good at political theatre. Dutch can turn a disagreement into a speech into a moral test, and a moral test into a crowd. Arthur would rather say the truth and expect decent people to hear it. That works with Charles. It works with Hosea. It works with Sadie. It may not work with men who need belonging more than evidence. A strong Arthur-led gang could still fracture, because Arthur does not know how to perform certainty for the frightened. He knows how to be reliable. But frightened people often choose performance before reliability, especially when performance reminds them of who they used to be. The money problem remains the hardest practical issue. The gang cannot simply decide to become safe. They are wanted criminals in 1899, hunted by lawmen, Pinkertons, and private interests. They have women, children, older members, sick members, and people with few legal options. Arthur may dream less than Dutch, but he still needs an exit. Here his leadership would likely become a balance between Hosea's cons, Charles's scouting, Sadie's boldness, and Arthur's own talent for hard jobs. The gang might turn towards smaller, cleaner robberies, fake identities, distant states, and gradual dispersal rather than one enormous score. That is less cinematic, but more realistic. The real rescue may not be Tahiti. It may be letting the gang stop being one large target. This is where Arthur differs most from Dutch. Dutch wants the whole family to remain whole, because the family proves the dream. Arthur, if forced to lead, might come to understand that saving the family means allowing it to break apart safely. That is a painful wisdom. Abigail, Jack and John should not remain tied to a moving outlaw camp forever. Tilly and Mary Beth deserve lives beyond hiding. Pearson could run a shop. Swanson could disappear into recovery or ruin on his own terms. Sadie may never return to quiet domestic life, but she deserves choice rather than being dragged behind Dutch's need for believers. Charles can choose a cause that matches his conscience. Hosea, if alive, may help people leave without making them feel like traitors. Arthur's great leadership discovery would be that the gang's survival depends on ending the gang gently. Of course, Dutch would experience that as betrayal. To Dutch, dispersal looks like death, because Dutch's identity is braided into being needed. He took in orphans, taught people to read, spoke of freedom, and made criminals feel chosen. There was real kindness in that once. That is what makes him tragic instead of empty. But by 1899, the family has become the mirror in which Dutch still sees himself as saviour. Arthur's leadership would hold up a crueler mirror. It would show that people can love Dutch and still leave. They can remember his good years and still refuse his last madness. They can be grateful for being rescued at 14 and still know the rescuer is now dangerous. If the St. Denis Bank is avoided, the gang might move north earlier, perhaps toward Roanoke Ridge, but under less panic. Beaver Hollow is one of the ugliest camps in the original story because it feels like moral infection made physical, damp, dark, hostile, cramped and haunted by the Murfree brood. Arthur as leader would likely avoid settling there unless absolutely forced. Charles would warn against it. Arthur would listen. The choice of camp matters in Red Dead because environment becomes psychology. Horseshoe gives the gang air, Clemens Point gives it warmth and illusion, Shady Bell gives it rot under grandeur, Beaver Hollow gives it burial. A leader who understands mood, even instinctively, would not choose burial unless the grave had already opened. Arthur might choose smaller temporary camps, hidden cabins, or a split structure instead. The vulnerable members could be sent ahead with Susan, Pearson and perhaps Charles. The active gun hands could remain separate to draw heat away. This would be dangerous, but it would solve one of the original gang's biggest problems, keeping everyone in one visible moving village while committing crimes nearby. Dutch insists on the family as a single body because he needs to stand at its centre. Arthur might learn to make the family a network instead. Letters, safe houses, hidden money, scattered roots. Less romance, more survival. The Wapiti storyline would become one of Arthur's defining moral tests. In the original story, Dutch exploits eagle flies and the tribe's conflict with the army as a distraction. Arthur, especially after his diagnosis, increasingly sees the ugliness in using people who are already being crushed by power. If Arthur leads earlier, he would be more likely to side with Rains Fall's caution than Dutch's provocation. He may still help steal documents from Cornwall. He may still aid Captain Monroe. He may still protect eagle flies when danger comes. But he would not treat the tribe's pain as cover for a bank job or train robbery. That difference could save eagle flies, or at least avoid pushing him faster toward a doomed fight. Rains Fall would matter deeply to leader Arthur. The chief offers something Dutch cannot, grief without performance. Rains Fall understands loss, restraint, rage, and the cost of young men being drawn into violence by those who promise meaning. Arthur, carrying leadership he never wanted, might hear him earlier and more clearly. Their conversations would not magically turn Arthur into a peaceful man. He has done too much and lived too hard for that. But they might teach him that refusing a fight can be an act of courage, especially when pride demands blood. A leader Arthur would need that lesson before the final collapse, not after half the camp is dead. Arthur's tuberculosis remains the great shadow. If the Downs encounter still infects him, leadership becomes a race between responsibility and time. He would hide it at first, because Arthur hides weakness the way other men hide stolen money. Hosea might notice. Charles might notice. Abigail might see it in the coughing and the way his face changes. Dutch, if estranged, might use it. Micah definitely would. Illness would give the rival faction a weapon. Arthur is dying. Arthur is weak. Arthur is dragging the gang towards surrender because he has lost his nerve. That accusation would hurt, because Arthur himself might fear pieces of it. He would have to decide whether his caution is wisdom or sickness talking. A dying leader Arthur would become more honest faster. In the original story, sickness strips away his illusions because he has so little time left to keep lying to himself. As leader, that stripping would be even harsher. Every decision would ask what can survive him. He could no longer pretend that loyalty to Dutch is the same as loyalty to the people. He could no longer postpone the question of John, Abigail and Jack. He could no longer tolerate Strauss's cruelty as background income. He could no longer let Micah remain near the heart of the camp for the sake of avoiding conflict. Illness would make his leadership less patient with rot. Strauss would almost certainly be expelled earlier. In the original story, Arthur throws him out after recognising the damage done through predatory lending, especially after seeing the Downs family's suffering. Under Arthur's leadership, that moment becomes public policy rather than personal disgust. He would tell the camp there will be no more money made by squeezing the desperate. Some members might object because money is money, and survival makes people ugly. But Arthur would know the difference between robbing a stage owned by a rich company and taking the last coins from a sick farmer. His morality is imperfect, but it is not empty. As leader, he would be forced to draw lines where Dutch preferred fog. The question of killing also changes. Arthur is a violent man, and a version where he leads cannot pretend otherwise. He has killed many people before the story begins, and he would kill more if he believed it protected the camp. But Arthur's violence is usually practical, defensive, or angry in immediate ways. Dutch's late violence becomes symbolic. He kills to reclaim the feeling of command. He kills Bronte in a manner meant to humiliate. He kills Cornwall because it feels like striking the head of power, even though it brings no real escape. Arthur would still shoot Cornwall's men if cornered. He might kill O'Driscoll's without much hesitation, but he would be less likely to murder powerful men simply because they wounded his self-image. That would reduce the gang's heat in ways that matter. Colm O'Driscoll's role under Arthur's leadership becomes sharper. The O'Driscoll feud is personal for Dutch because of Annabel, Colm's brother, old betrayal, and years of blood. Arthur hates O'Driscolls too, but his hatred is less theatrical. If Colm offers a parley, Arthur distrusts it immediately. In the original story, Arthur is captured because Dutch and Colm circle each other in a performance of old rivalry, and Arthur becomes bait. Under Arthur, the parley might never happen, or it would be approached with far more suspicion. Charles would scout. Shooters would be placed wider. Arthur would not stand in a valley letting old enemies write the shape of the meeting. Colm's trap depends on Dutch wanting the drama of facing Colm. Arthur does not need that drama. Kieran Duffy might fare better in this version. Arthur eventually warms to Kieran in his rough way after Kieran saves his life, but much of the camp never truly lets him stop being an O'Driscoll. Under Arthur, Kieran's usefulness and fear would be read more practically. Arthur might still threaten him early, but once Kieran proves himself, the leader's word could protect him more strongly. A camp with clearer discipline might make fewer jokes that isolate him, and better scouting might prevent the O'Driscolls from capturing him so easily. Saving Kieran does not change the world by itself, but it changes the camp's conscience. A family that cannot protect the frightened man it has accepted is already failing. Molly O'Shea's tragedy might also change. In the original story, Molly is neglected by Dutch, isolated by class and personality, then killed after falsely claiming she informed the Pinkertons. Her death reveals how brutal the gang's rules can become when fear replaces trust. If Arthur leads, Molly's position is different because she is no longer emotionally dependent on Dutch as the centre of power in the same way. She may still be lonely, she may still feel out of place, but Dutch's neglect would not carry the same political force. Susan might still be harsh, camp gossip would still sting, yet the fatal confession scene may never happen, because Molly's despair would not be tied so tightly to Dutch ignoring her while the gang collapses around his ego. Javier Escuela is one of the most delicate figures in this alternate road. Javier is loyal, romantic, musical, brave, and deeply attached to the idea that the gang stands for something more than theft. In the original story, his loyalty to Dutch becomes tragic because it leads him away from Arthur and John when the truth should be clear. Under Arthur, Javier might be saved if Arthur can speak to the ideals without mocking them. Arthur is not naturally eloquent, but he has sincerity Dutch loses. He could tell Javier that freedom means nothing if they become the kind of men who use the weak as cover. He could remind him that loyalty to people matters more than loyalty to a voice. Whether Javier accepts that depends on how much he needs the old dream. But Arthur at least gives him a path back to honour that does not require worship. Bill Williamson is harder. Bill follows strength, routine, and whoever makes him feel included. Arthur often insults him, and some of those insults are earned, but leadership would require more care. If Arthur humiliates Bill constantly, Dutch and Micah can pull him away with ease. If Arthur gives Bill clear work, clear rules, and occasional respect when he does something right, Bill might remain stable longer. He is not a natural traitor. He is insecure, violent, and easily led. Under better leadership, he may still be dangerous, but less immediately lost. The sad truth is that saving Bill may require Arthur to become a little kinder than Arthur wants to be. Sadie's path under Arthur becomes one of the most interesting changes. Without Dutch's late collapse dominating the camp, Sadie's fury could be shaped through responsibility rather than merely revenge. Arthur respects her because she proves herself, and she respects him because he does not pretend grief is gentle. He might let her ride earlier, but he would also challenge her when vengeance risks the camp. That kind of tension could deepen their bond. Sadie does not need to be protected from all danger. She needs to be treated as capable without being abandoned to self-destruction. Arthur, who knows something about living after your old life is gone, might understand that better than anyone. Charles would become Arthur's most important moral partner after Hosea. Charles sees clearly, speaks little, and acts when action is needed. He can hunt, track, fight, build, and read danger without needing to prove himself. Arthur trusts him, because Charles never wastes words. In an Arthur-led gang, Charles might become the person who tells Arthur when practicality is drifting toward cruelty. Hosea can advise through experience. Charles can advise through conscience. That combination gives Arthur a chance Dutch never truly accepts, the chance to be corrected without feeling destroyed. Lenny's survival would change Arthur's emotional world too. Lenny is young, smart, funny, and more aware of history than many around him. He brings a future into the camp, a future that the original story kills on a Saint Denis rooftop. If Arthur keeps the bank robbery from happening, Lenny remains one of the people worth building an exit for. Arthur might begin treating him less like a bright kid to drag along, and more like someone who should outlive the outlaw life entirely. He could ask Lenny to help with plans, accounts, letters, scouting reports, and quiet thinking. Lenny's education becomes useful to survival. His life becomes evidence that the gang does not have to feed all its young men to bad plans. Hosea's continued presence is perhaps the biggest difference of all. Dutch without Hosea becomes exposed, as even people around the story have recognised. Hosea is the old counterweight, the conman with a conscience, the man who knows Dutch's charm and flaws from decades of riding beside him. Under Arthur's leadership, Hosea might finally speak more plainly about Dutch's decline. He would not hate Dutch. That is important. Hosea loves him in the exhausted way old partners love each other after too much history. But love does not mean obedience. Hosea might help Arthur manage Dutch gently at first, then firmly, then finally from a distance if Dutch cannot accept the new order. There is a version where Dutch leaves before the final collapse. That may be the most haunting possibility. If Arthur leads and refuses the reckless path, Dutch may decide the gang has already died. He might take Micah, Bill, perhaps a few loyalists, and ride off to chase the old thunder somewhere else. He would frame it as courage. He would say Arthur has chosen fear, comfort, compromise, civilization, slow death. He would speak beautifully, because Dutch always speaks beautifully when he is losing control. Some would cry, some would be tempted. Arthur would stand there hating every second, because part of him would still feel like the 14-year-old boy Dutch saved. Then he would let him go. That moment would be Arthur's true test as leader. Not beating Micah, not robbing a bank, not out-shooting Pinkertons. The real test would be allowing Dutch to leave without chasing him to prove loyalty one last time. Arthur's tragedy in the original story is that he sees the truth too late to save the family, but not too late to save John. As leader, he might see the truth early enough to save more people, but only if he can survive the guilt of disobeying the man who raised him. Leadership, for Arthur, would feel like killing a father without firing a shot. If Dutch splits away with Micah, the Pinkerton problem changes but does not vanish. Milton and Ross are not hunting the gang because of Dutch alone. They are hunting a symbol of outlaw resistance, a list of crimes, a money trail, and men wanted across states. Arthur's group would need to disappear, negotiate, scatter, or make a deal from a position of caution. Arthur is unlikely to trust the Pinkertons, and he would be right. But he might understand that staying together as a famous armed camp is slow suicide. He could send the vulnerable east or north under false names, hide money in smaller caches, and reduce the number of crimes tying everyone together. The gang becomes less legendary, which is exactly how it survives. Would Arthur ever turn himself in to save others? That question sits near the heart of this version. Early Arthur would laugh at it, mid-story Arthur would hate it. Sick Arthur might consider it. If the Pinkertons offer safety for the women and children in exchange for Arthur, Hosea or Dutch, the moral pressure becomes unbearable. Dutch would call surrender a betrayal of everything. Arthur might call it buying time. He knows men like Milton lie, but he also knows running forever is not a plan. The most Arthur-like answer may be neither surrender nor defiance, but misdirection. Give the law something to chase while the others vanish. Arthur is at his most heroic when he becomes the shield and refuses to call it heroism. The Blackwater money remains a dangerous temptation. In the original story, the stash is like a ghost of the old gang's last hope. Everyone knows it exists, but reaching it is nearly impossible for most of the story. Dutch uses the idea of money as a future promise, while the actual path keeps getting bloodier. Arthur as leader would be more honest about it. The money may be lost for now. If a safe chance comes, they take it. If not, they stop living as if one buried prize can justify every bad decision. This would frustrate people who want certainty, but it would keep them from worshipping a pile of cash they cannot touch. The Tahiti dream would likely die early. Arthur is not immune to wanting escape, but he has never believed in Dutch's tropical fantasy the way Dutch needs him to. He mocks it because it sounds unreal, and because Arthur's imagination is tied to practical ground. Under his leadership, the dream becomes smaller and therefore more possible. A ranch for John's family, a shop for Pearson, a city life for Tilly, a quiet marriage somewhere for Mary Beth if she wants it, work for Charles where his conscience can breathe, a future for Jack with books instead of wanted posters. These are not grand dreams, but they are survivable dreams. Arthur's revolution would be reducing salvation to something ordinary enough to reach. Mary Linton would see Arthur differently if he were leader. Their relationship is built from old love, missed timing, class difference, and the painful knowledge that Arthur might have been another man in another life. If Mary asks for help while Arthur is carrying the gang's fate, the encounter becomes even more revealing. He would still help Jamie. He would still feel the old pull, but he could no longer imagine simply running away with her, even for a moment, without thinking of everyone depending on him. Mary represents the life Arthur cannot enter. Leadership would make that door close even more firmly. He would become more admirable and less available, which is a very Red Dead kind of sadness. Arthur's journal would become even more important in this alternate story. In the original, it reveals the inner life he rarely speaks aloud: drawings, doubts, regrets, jokes, observations, tenderness hidden behind rough language. As leader, the journal would carry the pressure of decisions. He might write less at first because he is busy, then more as illness and responsibility squeeze him. He would sketch camp members not as followers, but as lives he has to answer for. Jack reading, Abigail worrying, Hosea coughing, Dutch staring too long into the fire, Micah watching from the edge, Charles cleaning a rifle, Sadie sitting alone with grief, sharpened into purpose. The journal would become a private record of leadership as burden. One of the most painful truths is that Arthur's better leadership would not create a clean, happy ending. The age of outlaws is still ending. Government power is still expanding. Railroads, banks, oil, private detectives and federal force are still knitting the country into something men like Arthur cannot outride forever. A smarter leader can avoid some disasters, but he cannot make 1899 become 1870 again. This matters because the counterfactual should not turn Arthur into a magical cure. His gift is not that he can defeat history. His gift is that he can stop feeding people into history's mouth for the sake of Dutch's pride. If Arthur remains ill, his final phase would be less about exposing Dutch at the last second, and more about arranging the future before his body fails. He would send John away earlier, perhaps with money and papers prepared by Hosea. He would make Abigail leave whether John is ready or not. He would ask Sadie to escort them, and Sadie would do it with deadly seriousness. He would ask Charles to take certain people north. He would tell Tilly and Mary Beth exactly which train to take and who to avoid. Susan would hate being ordered to leave before the last work is done, but she might obey if Arthur frames it as protecting the young. Pearson would cry. Uncle would complain and go anyway. That evacuation would be the opposite of Dutch's last stand. Dutch gathers people inward because he cannot bear the centre emptying. Arthur would send them outward because the centre has become dangerous. The camp would feel strange in those final days, quieter with each departure. Less singing, fewer bedrolls, more hidden money changing hands, horses saddled before dawn, letters burned, names changed. Jack may be asleep in a wagon, not fully understanding that the only family he has known is dissolving around him. Arthur would watch it happen and feel both failure and relief. A leader who saves people by scattering them must accept that no one will sing songs about the moment. It looks too much like losing. Micah would not accept this quiet ending. Whether he remains inside the camp or rides with Dutch's splinter group, he needs chaos to profit. He might inform on Arthur earlier, trading locations or movements to the Pinkertons. He might try to seize the remaining money. He might push Dutch toward attacking Arthur, framing the evacuation as theft of the gang's future. The final confrontation could still happen, but with clearer lines. Arthur would not need to convince everyone that Micah is poison. Most of the people who trust Arthur would already know. The question would be whether Dutch can admit it before all that remains of his dream is Micah's grin. Imagine the final camp not as Beaver Hollow's fevered standoff, but as a hidden place half emptied by dawn, rain or mountain mist. Arthur coughing into a cloth. Hosea, if still alive, perhaps too old and tired to fight, but still sharp enough to see the last move. Dutch arrives with Micah and a few loyalists, accusing Arthur of stealing the family. Arthur answers that he saved who he could. Bill looks confused. Javier looks wounded. Micah smiles because confusion and wounded loyalty are the only soil he needs. Then the Pinkertons close in, because Micah has made sure they would. The old argument ends the way so many Red Dead arguments end. Not with the right words, but with gunfire. If Hosea lives to that moment, his role could be devastating. He might stand between Dutch and Arthur, not with a gun raised at first, but with the authority of 40 years. He could tell Dutch that the boy he raised became the man the gang needed, and that Dutch should be proud instead of jealous. Dutch might tremble under that truth. He might reject it. He might aim at Micah and not fire. He might aim at Arthur and find he cannot. Hosea's survival gives Dutch one last chance to be human before the myth consumes him. Whether he takes it is the great uncertainty. Arthur's final choice would still be John. Even if more people are saved, John remains the symbolic future, because Red Dead Redemption depends on him walking away long enough to build Beecher's hope, fail in his own ways, and face the consequences later. Arthur as leader would push John out with less ambiguity. He would tell him that leadership is not staying until every doomed man approves of you. It is leaving when your wife and child need you alive. John might resist because guilt is one of his oldest habits. Arthur would get angry because anger is how he pushes love through his own throat. Then he would give John money, maybe the good horse, maybe a route, and maybe one final insult gentle enough to mean goodbye. The ending could still place Arthur on a ridge with sunrise coming. That image belongs to him because his redemption is not about surviving. It is about direction. But in this version, the sunrise carries more lives inside it. Sean may be alive somewhere. Lenny may be on a train with books and a false name. Hosea may have died buying time, or he may be hidden with Susan and the last of the non-combatants. Abigail, Jack and John may be farther away before the noose tightens. Charles may be guiding people through country the law cannot read. Sadie may be riding behind them, making sure no one follows. Arthur dies with fewer illusions and less loneliness, because his leadership was not perfect, but it had moved people toward life. There is another possible ending, darker but still fitting. Arthur leads better, saves more, but still cannot save himself or Dutch. Dutch survives, humiliated by Arthur's success, and becomes the man John later hunts in the first Red Dead Redemption. Brilliant, bitter, violent, talking about freedom after the family that once gave the word meaning has scattered beyond his reach. In this version, Dutch's later madness may be even more tragic, because he was not merely betrayed by history, he was surpassed by the son he raised. Arthur's quiet competence becomes the wound Dutch can never name. Every time Dutch remembers the gang, he remembers that people followed Arthur when survival mattered more than speeches. Micah's fate depends on how early Arthur acts. If Arthur exiles or kills him before the Pinkerton betrayal deepens, Micah may never become the final parasite on Dutch's soul. But if Micah survives long enough to attach himself to Dutch's resentment, he still becomes dangerous. The difference is that he lacks the same access to the whole camp. He cannot isolate Arthur from everyone because Arthur is the centre. He cannot make Dutch's suspicion official camp doctrine because Dutch is no longer the official centre. Micah may still sell information, still form his own gang, still end up on Mount Hagen years later, but he would do so with less damage behind him. Sometimes saving the gang does not mean killing the villain at once, it means denying him the room to become inevitable. John's epilogue would change in quiet ways. If Arthur arranged escape earlier and provided cleaner money, John might not need to chase Micah years later for the Blackwater stash. That single difference could alter the road to Red Dead Redemption. In the original future, John killing Micah draws Edgar Ross and the government toward Beecher's hope, planting the seeds of John's later coercion. If Micah is already dead, or if John never goes after him, Ross may have a harder time finding John so cleanly. The old life still leaves tracks, but fewer tracks matter. Arthur's leadership could indirectly buy John more years, perhaps even a life where Jack grows up with less blood waiting at the gate. Yet, John is John. He carries restlessness, pride, love, shame, and a talent for turning peace into a thing he must earn through violence. Even with Arthur's better leadership, John may still struggle at Beecher's hope. Abigail may still have to demand that he stop being the man the gang trained him to be. Jack may still grow under the shadow of old stories. The government may still find a way to use the past. Red Dead rarely grants perfect escape, but Arthur leading could change the balance. Instead of John inheriting a disaster and one last command to run, he inherits a clearer lesson. Family is not proved by dying beside doomed men. It is proved by living for the people who need you after the shooting stops. The fates of Tilly and Mary Beth might brighten in this alternate path. In the original story, they survive and build lives beyond the gang, which already suggests that leaving was possible for those not chained too tightly to pride. Under Arthur, they might leave earlier, with money and protection rather than panic. Tilly could reach Saint Denis or another city without the terror of the final camp collapsing around her. Mary Beth could carry her stories into print with less grief behind each page. Their survival matters, because the gang was always more than its gunmen. A leader who saves only the famous shooters has misunderstood the family entirely. Pearson's later shop life also becomes a small proof of Arthur's philosophy. Pearson is not heroic in the usual sense. He cooks, complains, remembers the Navy, and survives. Under Dutch, people like Pearson are part of the circle gathered around the dream. Under Arthur, they become part of the reason to end the dream. A world where Pearson gets away earlier is not grand, but it is deeply meaningful. The cook living long enough to sell groceries is a better monument to leadership than another pile of stolen bonds. Arthur would never say that poetically. He would probably mutter that Pearson finally found a way to be useful. But he would be glad. Susan Grimshaw's fate could be one of the most satisfying changes. In the original story, she sides with Arthur and is killed by Micah during the final confrontation. Her death is brutal because she represents the old camp order choosing the truth too late to be protected. Under Arthur's leadership, Susan might become one of the pillars who helps evacuate the camp before the last standoff. She would not go gently. She would scold, organise, threaten, pack, and make terrified people move when fear freezes them. If she survives, it feels right because she was always a leader in the practical sense. Arthur's rise would finally make that visible. Uncle would somehow survive either way, because Uncle has the strange talent of drifting through catastrophe, with complaints intact. Under Arthur, he might be pushed into helping more often, though not as much as Arthur wants. He would still talk about lumbago. He would still disappear when work becomes too specific. But even Uncle has value in a scattered family. He remembers, jokes, irritates, and keeps ordinary foolishness alive. A camp with no fools becomes too close to a military unit. Arthur may roll his eyes at him, but part of the gang's humanity lives in people who are not useful every second of the day. Dutch's ideology would be exposed under Arthur more quickly. Dutch speaks of freedom, but he often needs the gang to remain dependent. Arthur's leadership would ask what freedom actually looks like when applied to real people. If someone wants to leave, can they leave? If Abigail wants safety for Jack, is that betrayal? If Charles chooses to help the Wapiti, is that disloyalty? If Mary Beth wants a quiet life, has she abandoned the cause? Dutch's answers become more controlling as the story darkens. Arthur's better answer would be imperfect, but clearer. People are not free because they repeat the word freedom around a campfire. They are free when they can choose a life beyond the camp. This is why Arthur could never lead the gang exactly as Dutch did. He lacks Dutch's appetite for myth. That might make him less inspiring in the early years, when the gang needed a dream to hold together. A younger Arthur could not have founded the Van der Linde gang. He could not have walked into the lives of lost children and made crime sound like education, rebellion, and family. Dutch and Hosea created something Arthur inherited. Arthur's gift is different. He is the leader the gang needs at the end, when the dream has become dangerous and someone must decide who gets out alive. That distinction keeps the counterfactual honest. Arthur being a better late leader does not mean Arthur was always meant to replace Dutch. Dutch's charisma built the family. Hosea's cleverness sustained it. Susan's discipline maintained it. Arthur's strength protected it. By 1899, the order should have changed because the world changed. The tragedy is that Dutch could not become elder, advisor, or memory. He had to remain centre. Arthur's leadership would be the natural evolution the gang was too emotionally tangled to accept. It would be the son becoming the adult while the father still demanded applause. The camp mood under Arthur would be less grand and perhaps more restful. There would be fewer speeches about paradise and more arguments about roots, fewer declarations that one more score would solve everything, and more quiet planning about who leaves when. The songs would still happen, the jokes would still happen, the robberies would still happen. This is still an outlaw gang, not a church picnic. But the emotional temperature would cool. People would worry, but they would not be constantly asked to transform worry into faith. That alone might let them sleep better, and sleep is no small thing in a world always hunting them. Arthur's relationship with honour becomes different when he leads. In the original story, honour is personal. The choices he makes as death approaches, the people he helps, the cruelty he rejects, the mercy he learns. As leader, honour becomes structural. It is no longer enough for Arthur to help one widow if the camp keeps producing widows. It is no longer enough to spare one frightened debtor if Strauss keeps hunting the poor. It is no longer enough to save John at the end if the gang keeps endangering Jack. Leadership forces morality out of private feeling and into rules, roots, money, and consequences. That would make Arthur uncomfortable, but it would also make his redemption larger. The strongest Arthur-led version of the gang might have a council without calling it one. Arthur would never sit everyone down and announce a new democratic philosophy. He would find that embarrassing. But in practice, Hosea, Susan, Charles, Abigail, and sometimes Sadie would shape decisions. Hosea would judge cons. Charles would judge land and risk. Susan would judge camp readiness. Abigail would speak for the child and the possibility of normal life. Sadie would judge action when waiting becomes cowardice. Arthur would still make final calls, but the calls would pass through more reality before becoming orders. Dutch's leadership narrows as he declines. Arthur's could widen if he learns to listen. Abigail's voice in that council would be especially important. The gang often treats her fear as noise because fear is inconvenient. Arthur knows better. Fear can be information. A mother scared for her son may see danger earlier than men chasing reputation. If Abigail says a camp is no place for Jack, Arthur should hear more than complaint. He should hear the future speaking. Dutch loves Jack as part of the family image, but he does not build a world Jack can safely inherit. Arthur, once leader, would begin measuring plans by whether they make Jack's life larger or smaller. that is a better compass than Tahiti. There is a tender possibility that Arthur and John reconcile earlier. Not in a dramatic speech, because neither man is built for clean emotional declarations. It would happen through work. Arthur gives John responsibility. John fails, then tries again. Arthur snaps, then trusts him with something important. John sees Arthur coughing when he thinks no one is watching. Arthur sees John lift Jack or stand beside Abigail with less distance in his body. They do not become gentle men overnight. But the old resentment begins losing its grip. Arthur's leadership might give John the thing Dutch never fully gives him late in the story, a model of leaving as duty rather than cowardice. The strange beauty of this alternate path is that Arthur's best decisions would often look like anti-climax. No St. Denis Bank massacre, no Guarma shipwreck, no final camp swollen with everyone trapped in the same nightmare. Instead, avoided traps, delayed jobs, smaller departures, less legendary robberies, quieter goodbyes. That can sound less dramatic, but for the people inside the story, less drama is mercy. Red Dead Redemption 2 shows how often men mistake drama for meaning. Arthur, at his best, would learn to choose meaning without spectacle. Still, the guns would not disappear. The Pinkertons would come. O'Driscolls would strike. Cornwall's men would hunt. Bronte's world would not forgive insult. The army would still crush the Wapiti. The law would still tighten. Arthur would still have to fight, and some fights would be terrible. What changes is the reason. Under Dutch, violence increasingly protects Dutch's belief in himself. Under Arthur, violence would protect escape routes, vulnerable people, and the possibility of ending the outlaw life. That does not make every killing righteous. It simply makes the direction clearer. Arthur's redemption is never purity. It is turning the horse towards someone else's dawn. If Arthur avoids the worst St. Denis disaster, he may never experience Guarma, and that absence removes one of the original story's strange fever dreams. Guarma shows the gang outside America, stripped of its familiar landscape, trapped in another system of exploitation and rebellion. It hardens Dutch and exhausts Arthur. Without it, the story stays grounded in the American collapse more directly. The gang does not need an island to reveal that Dutch is losing himself. The revelation happens at camp, in choices, in who is allowed to leave, in whether the Wapiti are used, in whether Micah is trusted, in whether money matters more than people. The fever comes home without crossing the sea. Arthur's leadership would also change the emotional meaning of camp chores. In the original world, chopping wood, carrying hay, donating food, and bringing supplies can feel like small contributions to a family that's already doomed. Under Arthur, those chores become part of a more serious attempt to keep people alive until they can leave. A sack of grain is more than a small routine. It is another day bought. A deer brought to Pearson is not flavour. It is evidence that survival does not always need a robbery. Arthur, who understands hunting and work better than speeches, would value those things openly. That would reshape what the camp respects. Money from honest or semi-honest work might become less shameful. The Van der Linde gang often acts as if only grand outlaw action can preserve its soul, but Arthur knows how much of life is labour. He may still rob when necessary, but he would not despise work in the same theatrical way. He has too much respect for horses, tools, weather, and the body's limits. Under his leadership, some members might take temporary labour, scouting, hunting, guiding, guarding, or trading under false names. That does not turn them respectable. It gives them breathing room. Dutch fears ordinary work because it makes his revolution feel unnecessary. Arthur might come to see ordinary work as the bridge out. This raises a difficult question. Could Arthur have become rancher leader before John ever did? Probably not for himself. Arthur's life is too marked, his sickness too heavy if the Downs path remains. and his self-image too damaged. He can imagine other people free more easily than he can imagine himself free. That is why his leadership would be sacrificial without becoming sugary. He is not building a future where he sits on a porch, clean and forgiven. He is building one where Jack might read, where Abigail might stop scanning the horizon for lawmen, where John might become boring enough to survive. Arthur's imagination of peace is strongest when he gives it away. Dutch would call that weakness because Dutch's idea of freedom is always moving, always resisting, always needing an enemy. Arthur's idea of freedom, once stripped down by responsibility, becomes quieter. A door that closes safely. A name that does not draw a gun. A child who does not know the sound of Pinkertons at dawn. A woman who can sleep without a packed bag. A man who can work land without pretending he was born innocent. That is less romantic than Dutch's dream, but far more humane. It is the difference between freedom as a speech and freedom as a morning when no one has to run. If Arthur were leader from much earlier in the gang's history before Blackwater, the story becomes harder to imagine because Arthur would first need to become a different man. He was shaped by Dutch. He learned loyalty, violence, reading, pride, and belonging under Dutch's shadow. A young Arthur could not have led the old gang because he did not yet have a self outside the man who saved him. That is why the best pivot remains 1899. By then, Arthur has enough doubt, enough competence, and enough buried tenderness to lead differently. He's still flawed enough to be interesting, but wounded enough to begin changing. The counterfactual also reveals why Rockstar's original tragedy works so well. Arthur would have been a better leader near the end, but the gang could not recognise that without ceasing to be Dutch's gang. The family's identity was built around Dutch as father. To replace him would feel like destroying the thing they were trying to save. That is how abusive or failing systems endure. The solution looks like betrayal before it looks like survival. Arthur's tragedy is not simply that he dies. It is that the authority he needed was already in him, but loyalty kept him from using it until there was almost nothing left to lead. One of the most moving scenes in this imagined version would be a quiet conversation between Arthur and Hosea after the first real split with Dutch. No dramatic music in the mind, no grand declaration, just two men sitting away from camp while the fire burns low. Hosea might admit that he should have challenged Dutch harder years ago. Arthur might say he does not know how to do this. Hosea might answer that not knowing is a better start than Dutch pretending he knows everything. Arthur would laugh without much humour. Then they would talk about roots, money, and who needs to leave first. That is how love survives in their world. Not through speeches, but through planning. Another powerful moment would belong to Arthur and Dutch, not as enemies yet, but as father and son standing on opposite sides of what the family needs. Dutch might accuse Arthur of losing faith. Arthur might answer that faith never fed anybody by itself. Dutch might say he made Arthur. Arthur might say quietly that he knows. That would hurt more than shouting. Because Arthur does know. He owes Dutch pieces of himself, and that debt makes the truth harder. A clean villain can be abandoned with relief. A fallen father has to be mourned while still alive. If Dutch eventually accepts Arthur's leadership, even briefly, the story becomes almost unbearably sad in another way. Imagine Dutch stepping back after Hosea confronts him, admitting that Arthur should take the practical lead while he remains advisor. For a few weeks the camp improves. Dutch gives speeches but fewer orders. Arthur handles roots. Hosea handles cons. People breathe. Then Dutch begins fading, not into violence first, but into irrelevance. He watches the family continue without his hand on every decision. For a man like Dutch, irrelevance may be more frightening than death. Micah would not need to invent the wound. He would only need to touch it. That is why Micah's most dangerous line would be simple. They do not need you anymore. He would say it to Dutch at the right moment, perhaps after Arthur returns from a successful job Dutch didn't plan. He would say Arthur thinks he is better than you. He would say Hosea pities you. He would say John laughs behind your back. He would say the women trust Arthur now. Lies and half-truths together, which are Micah's favourite mixture. Dutch might resist at first. Then he would remember every time someone looked to Arthur before looking to him. A gang can survive hunger more easily than a proud man survives replacement. Arthur, meanwhile, would be too busy to notice every emotional shift. This is one of his weaknesses. He can read tracks, danger, and guilt, but he may miss the slow theatre of resentment until it has gathered a circle of believers. Hosea would see it. Susan might see it. Abigail would definitely see it, because she is used to reading men who pretend their pride is principle. If they warn Arthur, he might wave it off. He might say Dutch is Dutch, Micah is Micah, and they have bigger problems. That mistake could cost him. Practical men sometimes underestimate the damage caused by wounded vanity, because wounded vanity seems too foolish to shape history. Red Dead knows better. The final split might therefore come not from a failed robbery, but from a successful rescue. Arthur sends families away, keeps money hidden, avoids a trap, or saves eagle flies without turning the wapiti into bait. The camp praises him. Dutch hears relief in their voices. Relief wounds him because it does not pass through him first. Micah turns that wound into accusation. Suddenly, Arthur's success becomes evidence against him. He is making the gang small. He is breaking the dream. He is choosing women and children over freedom. He is letting civilization scare him. That is how a better path still leads to blood. The people most invested in the old disaster cannot survive the proof that another way existed. Arthur's confrontation with Dutch would be calmer than the original, which may make it more devastating. He would not need to scream that Micah is the rat if the split has been visible for weeks. He might simply say, I am getting them out. Dutch might say, you do not get to decide that. Arthur might answer, somebody has to. Behind them, the camp would understand that the argument is no longer about a job. It is about what the gang was for. Was it built to keep Dutch's dream alive, or to protect the people Dutch once claimed to love? That is the whole tragedy in one question. If Arthur dies after saving more people, the memory of him changes the surviving gang. In the original story, many survivors remember him privately, but John carries the clearest debt. In this alternate version, Arthur becomes the reason an entire scattering was possible. Tilly's daughter may grow up because Arthur sent her mother away with money. Mary Beth's books may carry hidden echoes of him. Pearson may keep a picture behind a counter. Charles may remember him as the man who finally understood that leaving can be honourable. Sadie may carry his blunt mercy into every bounty she takes. Abigail may speak his name softly when John is being foolish. Jack may not fully remember his voice, but he grows inside the shelter of Arthur's decision. Dutch's later life would be haunted by that memory too. If he survives, he cannot honestly say Arthur betrayed the family if the family lived because of Arthur, so he would have to distort the memory. He might call Arthur weak, then miss him. He might call him a traitor, then keep some small object from the old camp. He might blame Hosea, Micah, the Pinkertons, civilization, fate, anything except the unbearable truth that Arthur loved the gang more cleanly at the end than Dutch did. That kind of truth can drive a proud man mad. By the time John sees Dutch years later, Dutch may no longer be running from the law as much as from that judgment. There is also a brighter branch where Dutch does one decent thing before disappearing. Perhaps in the final confrontation, after Micah's betrayal is exposed, Dutch shoots Micah earlier than he does in the original future. Not because Dutch is redeemed completely, but because Arthur's leadership gives him one last clear mirror. He sees Micah for what he is. He sees Arthur dying and still trying to save people. He sees the family emptying because survival required it. For one moment, Dutch acts like the man he once wanted to be. Then he leaves, unable to stay inside the ruin of his own myth. That would not erase his damage, but Red Dead has always allowed small, late mercies to matter. Would Arthur survive if he avoided the Downs infection? That is the tempting golden path. If leader Arthur restricts Strauss early enough, never beats Thomas Downs, and never contracts tuberculosis, the whole future opens. A healthy Arthur has more time, more strength, and more chance to build an exit that includes himself. But there is a danger in making that version too clean. Arthur without the illness may take longer to confront his morality. Death is not the only reason he changes, but it accelerates the honesty. A healthy leader, Arthur might save more lives practically while delaying his own redemption emotionally. He could become a stern outlaw chief who keeps people alive, but still avoids asking what kind of life they are being kept alive for. The strongest healthy Arthur ending would require him to learn the lesson through leadership rather than sickness. Instead of mortality forcing him to change, responsibility does. He sees Jack, Abigail, Downs, Rainsfall, Kieran, Molly, Lenny, and the frightened people at the edges of every job. He realizes that a gang cannot claim to fight a corrupt world while copying its cruelties on a smaller scale. That realization might take longer without the doctor's diagnosis, but it could still arrive. In that branch, Arthur might actually live long enough to vanish after everyone else is safe. Not forgiven by law, not innocent, but alive somewhere with a name no one knows, carrying a journal full of people he helped leave. Would Mary find him then? Maybe once, years later. A meeting in a town where both are older and quieter. She sees a man who survived but did not become clean. He sees the life he once could not choose. They speak kindly, maybe sadly, without reopening what time has closed. Arthur might have no grand home, no shining future, but he might have peace enough to sit without watching every door. That is a beautiful branch, though perhaps too gentle for Red Dead's main road. Still, the thought belongs near the edge of the campfire, where impossible mercies are allowed to glow for a moment. More realistically, even a healthy Arthur would remain wanted, scarred, and difficult to place in the new century. The world has little room for men like him except as labourers, guards, ranch hands, bounty hunters, or ghosts. He might ride with Charles for a time, helping people who need quiet violence used carefully. He might work under a false name at some remote ranch. He might visit Beecher's Hope once and leave before Jack asks too many questions. He might never marry, never settle, never fully believe he deserves the peace he bought for others, but living with that doubt is still different from dying under it. The question of Arthur as leader ultimately reveals what leadership means in Red Dead Redemption 2. Dutch believes leadership is vision. Hosea believes it is judgment. Susan knows it is discipline. Charles shows it as steadiness. Abigail demands that it be protection. Sadie tests whether it can make room for rage without being ruled by it. John learns too late that leadership sometimes means going home. Arthur, if placed at the centre, would have to gather all of those meanings and carry them badly at first, then better, then finally with the kind of grace he would never call grace. The gang under Arthur would still be an outlaw gang. That has to remain clear. They would still rob, they would still frighten people, they would still leave damage behind. Arthur would still make mistakes, perhaps terrible ones. A top-tier version of this idea should not turn him into a saint wearing a gun belt. What makes Arthur compelling is not purity. It is the slow collision between what he has done and what he can still choose. As leader, that collision becomes larger, because every choice echoes through the camp. His redemption would no longer be one man saving one family at the end. It would be one man learning that a family may need to be dismantled to be saved. Shady Belle deserves its own quiet place in this alternate road, because it is the camp where the gang begins living inside a dead aristocratic shell. The mansion is grand, but it is rotting. Its rooms are too formal for the people hiding there, and its old southern ghosts hang in the wallpaper. Under Dutch, Shady Belle becomes a stage where the gang pretends it can still move upward, closer to St. Denis, closer to a grand score, closer to the money that will solve the unsolvable. Under Arthur, Shady Belle would be treated as a temporary safe house with bad energy. He would use the roof, the walls, the distance from town and the cover of the swamps, but he would not mistake it for progress. A ruined mansion is shelter, not destiny. That distinction matters because the gang is deeply vulnerable to symbols. Dutch sees a fine house and imagines regained stature. He sees Bronte's party and imagines himself entering the machinery of power. He sees a bank and imagines a final victory against the city. Arthur sees the same things and feels mud on his boots. He knows a big house can still be a bad camp. He knows fancy people can still smell desperation. He knows a room full of politicians, businessmen and criminals is not proof that the gang has arrived. It is proof that they are walking into a different kind of trap. Shady Belle under Arthur would have guards, exit routes, food stores, and a plan to leave. Dutch's Shady Belle has atmosphere. Arthur's would have contingencies. The St. Denis Mayor's party would also change. In the original story, the party is a strange performance where the gang enters high society and tries to gather leads while wearing clothes that cannot hide who they are. Arthur moves through that world awkwardly, observant and uncomfortable. Dutch, meanwhile, enjoys the drama of proximity to power. If Arthur leads, he might still allow Hosea and Trelawney to use the party for information, because those men understand masks. But Arthur himself would be less eager to stand near the chandelier. He would notice servants, guards, exits, side conversations, and the way rich men use politeness as armour. He would come away with leads, but also with a warning. St. Denis does not have to chase the gang into the woods. It can swallow them politely. Trelawney becomes more valuable in an Arthur-led structure because Trelawney understands a truth Dutch resists. Sometimes survival depends on appearing to belong nowhere. Trelawney slips in and out, changes clothes, changes manners, and keeps distance from the camp's emotional gravity. Dutch dislikes that kind of looseness because he wants loyalty visible. Arthur might be annoyed by Trelawney's disappearances, but he would recognise the usefulness of a man who knows how to pass through civilised spaces without turning every room into a stage. In this version, Trelawney could help create false papers, safe contacts, train routes, and quieter exits. His slippery nature becomes a tool for dispersal rather than a reason for suspicion. Josiah's influence could even teach Arthur something leadership does not come naturally to him. Arthur understands directness. Trelawney understands presentation. A wanted person needs both. If the gang is to dissolve safely, people need names, clothes, stories, accents, and habits that do not point back to Dutch. Arthur might hate the fuss of it. He might mock the tailored coats and careful lies. But he would see Tilly safer in a city if she can move through it without looking hunted. He would see Mary Beth safer if she can become a writer instead of a runaway. He would see John safer if his papers say ranch hand before anyone remembers outlaw. In that sense, Trelawney's theatricality becomes the opposite of Dutch's. One performance traps people in the dream, the other helps them escape it. Leviticus Cornwall remains a problem because he represents the kind of power Arthur cannot intimidate for long. Cornwall has money, private security, political reach, oil interests, rail interests, and enough pride to make a stolen train feel like a personal insult. Dutch wants to confront him because Cornwall is everything Dutch claims to hate. Arthur would hate him too, but with a different instinct. He would not believe killing Cornwall solves the system Cornwall belongs to. That is the decisive difference. In the original story, Dutch murders Cornwall in Ansburg, and the act feels bold for a moment before revealing itself as another escalation. Under Arthur, Cornwall would be avoided, robbed carefully if unavoidable, and treated as weather, dangerous, larger than one man, and not worth shouting at in the open. Ansburg would therefore arrive with a heavier industrial sadness rather than a dramatic murder. Arthur would still see the coal dust, the exhausted miners, the company town, the way men are used up by a rich man's machine. That would anger him, especially if his own sickness is worsening. But as leader, anger has to become protection, not spectacle. He might help people there quietly. He might steal payroll or supplies if it can be done without dragging the whole camp into retaliation. He might use Cornwall's documents to aid rain's fall, but he would not stand exposed on a dock simply to prove that one rich tyrant can bleed. Arthur knows men bleed. The harder truth is that the machine keeps moving afterward. Milton and Ross would read Arthur differently from Dutch. Dutch is a symbolic target, the charismatic outlaw philosopher, the leader with speeches, the name that flatters the law's desire to crush rebellion. Arthur as leader is less poetic, but perhaps more dangerous because he is harder to bait. Milton can provoke Dutch by insulting his dream. Ross can study pride, vanity, and the need to be seen. Arthur gives them fewer handles. He is angry, yes. He is violent, yes. But he does not need to explain himself to the law. A Pinkerton offer delivered to Arthur would meet a colder man. He would assume every promise is a trap, every guarantee is temporary, and every conversation is being used to measure the camp's fear. Still, Milton might find another weakness: Arthur's responsibility. Dutch can be manipulated through ego. Arthur can be pressured through the vulnerable. If Milton understands that Arthur cares more about Abigail, Jack, Tilly, Mary Beth, Swanson, Pearson, and the others than about his own legend, the law can threaten them. That creates a different kind of cat and mouse. Arthur would need to separate the camp before Milton can use the non-combatants as leverage. A single large camp gives the Pinkertons one net to throw. A scattered family gives them many trails, some cold, some false, some protected by people like Charles and Sadie. Arthur's best legal defence is not a faster gun. It is making the target disappear into ordinary life. The army payroll train would probably become the final temptation in this version. Even if the St. Denis Bank is avoided, even if Bronte is handled carefully, even if Cornwall is not murdered, the gang still needs a larger reserve to fund escape. A military payroll train offers money, movement, and the danger of federal attention all at once. Dutch sees that kind of job as a grand ending. Arthur would see it as a possible sacrifice play. If he chooses to take it, the goal would not be one last glorious robbery for the gang's future paradise. It would be a controlled strike to finance dispersal. The difference is not cosmetic. It changes who is allowed near the job, how much risk is accepted, and what happens afterward. Arthur would not bring the entire emotional weight of the gang onto the train. He would choose a small crew, Charles for tracking and calm, Sadie if the job needs ferocity, John if John has already accepted responsibility enough to follow orders, perhaps Lenny if stealth and quick thinking matter, and Hosea only if his health and age allow the planning without the danger. Bill might be left out if his nerves are too loud. Javier might be included only if Arthur trusts his loyalty to the people over Dutch's wounded pride. Micah would never touch the plan if Arthur has any sense left. A final job under Arthur becomes less about proving courage and more about limiting who can be lost. If the payroll robbery succeeds, the money would be divided immediately, not stored as a sacred camp treasure. This is important. Shared hidden money becomes shared doom. It keeps people tied to the same secret and the same future argument. Arthur would place portions with trusted people. Abigail and Jack get enough to vanish. Tilly and Mary Beth get enough to start elsewhere. Pearson gets enough for a shop. Swanson gets enough for passage and a chance, though whether he uses it well is another matter. Charles refuses more than he needs. Sadie accepts enough ammunition, supplies, and money to move as she chooses. John gets money with instructions he hates. The old Blackwater stash was a mythic pile. Arthur's escape fund would become many small lives. If the payroll job fails, Arthur would still use the failure differently than Dutch. Dutch turns failure into proof that everyone must double down. Arthur would turn failure into evidence that the window is closing. He would not say, "one more score." He would say, "no more big jobs." That is one of the defining lines of this alternate story. The moment Arthur understands that the gang cannot earn its way to safety through louder crimes, the outlaw logic breaks. Dutch never fully accepts that. Arthur might accept it because he has buried too many people who trusted the next plan. Dutch's splinter faction, if it forms, would likely chase precisely the jobs Arthur rejects. That makes the contrast painfully clear. Arthur's camp becomes smaller, poorer, quieter, and more focused on exits. Dutch's group becomes louder, riskier, and more devoted to proving the old life still has fire. Micah thrives there. Bill feels useful there. Javier feels the language of rebellion there, at least for a while. The tragedy is that Dutch's splinter might look more alive from the outside. More raids, more noise, more boldness, more declarations. Arthur's path looks like retreat. Only later does the truth appear. One path spends lives to preserve a feeling, and the other spends pride to preserve lives. Camp morale would suffer under Arthur in a way that should not be ignored. Safety can feel like defeat to people raised on movement and myth. Some would miss Dutch's speeches, even those who know they're dangerous. People want to believe their suffering has grandeur. Arthur offers less grandeur. He offers a guarded route, a hidden purse, a false name, a hard goodbye. That is better for survival, but it can feel smaller to the heart. A top-tier version of Arthur's leadership has to let that sadness exist. He saves people partly by disappointing their hunger for legend. He gives them life, but not the old music. Arthur himself would miss the old music too. He would never admit it cleanly, but there would be nights when he hears Javier playing, or Sean laughing if Sean lives, or Dutch speaking softly to someone by the fire, and he would ache for the time when belief felt easier. Leadership would make him lonely because it forces him to become the person who ends the comfort he also needed. That is one reason this counterfactual remains tragic. Arthur is not standing outside the dream with perfect clarity. He's inside it, cutting exits into the walls while part of him still remembers being warmed by the same fire. The women's experience of the gang would become one of the clearest signs of whether Arthur is actually leading better. In Dutch's camp, the rhetoric of family often covers unequal burdens. The women cook, mend, gather information, endure danger, manage emotions, and are still sometimes treated as secondary to the men with guns. Arthur is not free of that world's assumptions, but he is observant enough to learn. If he listens to Abigail, Susan, Tilly, Mary Beth, Karen and Sadie, the camp becomes smarter. Karen's decline after Sean might be addressed sooner if Sean dies, or softened if he survives. Tilly's history with the Foreman brothers would be taken as security information, not background sadness. Mary Beth's intelligence would be used for reading people, not dismissed because it arrives gently. Leadership widens when it stops wasting the knowledge of those who've been surviving quietly all along. Karen Jones is especially worth remembering. In the original story, Karen fades into grief, drink, and disappearance after the gang's collapse. She's clever, funny, brave in cons, and more fragile than she first appears. Under Arthur, her fate could improve if the camp loses fewer people, and if someone notices her slipping. Arthur is not naturally good at emotional rescue, but Susan is, in her harsh way, and Mary Beth and Tilly would know before the men do. A better-led camp gives them space to intervene. Karen might still struggle, especially if Sean dies in any branch, but she would not have to drown inside a camp too busy collapsing to see her. Saving Karen would be one of those quiet victories no outlaw song would mention. Reverend Swanson's path could also soften. Arthur's relationship with Swanson in the original story carries irritation, pity, and a strange tenderness. Swanson is a man who has fallen apart publicly, which makes him easy to dismiss. Under Arthur as leader, Swanson might be sent away earlier with enough money and instruction to find a church, a clinic, or simply distance. Arthur would not frame it as mercy. He might say the Reverend is no use half dead in camp. But the effect is mercy all the same. Some people are not saved by being kept close. They are saved by being removed from the place that keeps witnessing their worst self. The question of loyalty would become calmer and more painful. Dutch defines loyalty as faith in him, especially as his decisions worsen. Arthur would define it more reluctantly through action. Loyalty is feeding the camp. Loyalty is telling the truth before the trap closes. Loyalty is leaving when your child needs safety. Loyalty is refusing to let a friend use grief as fuel for a doomed war. Loyalty can even mean disobeying the man who taught you the word. That version of loyalty is harder to dramatize, but stronger. It does not need a speech. It needs a train ticket pressed into someone's hand before dawn. This alternate Arthur would still have to punish betrayal, and that is where his mercy meets its limit. If Micah is proven to be feeding information to the Pinkertons, Arthur would not debate endlessly. The problem is not revenge, it is containment. A rat inside a scattered escape plan can kill people who are already on the road. Arthur might confront Micah privately if he wants certainty, but once the proof is there, he would act. The difference from Dutch is that Arthur would not turn the punishment into theatre for his ego. He would do what he believed necessary, hate the ugliness of it, and move on before more people paid for delay. There is a chilling possibility that Micah, under Arthur's tighter leadership, becomes more dangerous precisely because he is cornered earlier. A loose Micah can play the long game. A trapped Micah may strike fast. He could expose a camp location, lure a small group into ambush, or feed Milton just enough to force Arthur into an impossible rescue. That kind of move fits him. He does not need to defeat Arthur morally. He only needs to create a situation where Arthur's protective instinct becomes a weakness. If Abigail or Jack is threatened, Arthur will ride. If Sadie is trapped, Arthur will ride. If John is captured, Arthur will ride. Micah would know that about him and hate him for it. That means the final battle may still be triggered by rescue. Red Dead loves the shape of a man riding into danger because love has made retreat impossible. Arthur could be leading well, scattering people carefully, avoiding grand mistakes, and still be pulled into one last violent knot because someone is taken. The difference is that he would enter it with clearer purpose. Not to save the dream, not to prove courage, not to recover a pile of money as the answer to everything. He rides because a specific person is in danger. That kind of motive is smaller than Dutch's and far cleaner. If John is captured in this alternate version, Arthur would rescue him immediately, not as an act of defiance against Dutch, but as policy. No one gets left to rot if rescue is possible and the risk is understood. That single rule would reshape camp trust. People can survive fear if they believe they will not be abandoned for convenience. Dutch breaks that trust when he leaves John and Arthur behind in the original story. Arthur's leadership would be tested by whether he can preserve it even when rescue is costly. A family that cannot risk itself for its members has already become a gang in the coldest sense. The moral cost of rescue is that it can endanger everyone else. Arthur would know this, and it would torment him. If he rides after one captured man, does he expose the whole escape network? If he refuses, does he become Dutch by another road? This is where Hosea's advice would be vital. Hosea might say that love without judgment gets people killed, but judgment without love is just another form of cowardice. Arthur would hate that answer because it gives him no easy rule. Leadership often means living inside questions that do not cleanly resolve. That is one more reason Arthur never wanted it. The visual rhythm of the alternate final act would be slower than the original, but rich with dread. Instead of the gang visibly decaying in one place, the world would feel like it is emptying around Arthur. Bedrolls gone, wagons missing, familiar voices absent at breakfast, a pot cooking for fewer mouths, Dutch's tent either abandoned or occupied like a shrine to a fading age, Arthur riding between safe points, coughing into his glove, carrying letters, checking on people, returning to camp with less and less reason to stay. The collapse becomes quieter, but the quiet carries its own ache. The gang dies by becoming many separate lives. Jack's memory becomes a gentle measure of success. In the original story, Jack remembers enough of the gang to carry its ghosts, yet he is still young enough to be shaped by what comes after. Under Arthur's leadership, Jack might remember Arthur less as the sick man at the edge of the final disaster, and more as the gruff uncle who made people pack, ride, hide and survive. Maybe he remembers a horse ride, maybe a candy Arthur pretended not to buy, maybe Arthur telling John to stop being a fool within earshot. Those small memories matter. A child saved from legend may grow with fragments instead of trauma. That is one of the kindest endings the Red Dead world can offer. Edgar Ross's later hunt would become less direct if the gang disperses cleanly. Ross is patient, ambitious, and willing to use a man's family as leverage, but he needs trails. He needs bodies, witnesses, money movement, old associates, and revenge missions that point backward. If Arthur prevents John from killing Micah on Mount Hagen, one of Ross's cleanest paths may vanish. Ross might still find John through other records, especially if John buys land under his own name, but the chain weakens. Arthur's leadership cannot erase the government's reach, yet it can make the past less brightly marked. In a world of wanted men, dullness is protection. John's purchase of Beecher's Hope would still be risky. Even in a better branch, John's desire for legitimacy leads him into paperwork, loans, property and visibility. Arthur might warn him against putting down roots too publicly too soon. Abigail might argue that a family cannot live forever as smoke. Both would be right. That tension is at the heart of John's future. Arthur can teach him to leave the gang, but he cannot teach him how to become ordinary without mistakes. Ordinary life has its own traps. Banks, deeds, neighbours, old grudges, and the need to stop solving fear with a gun. Arthur's influence helps, but John must still become John. If Arthur lives long enough to see Beecher's Hope, even once from a distance, the moment would be almost too heavy. He would see the house rising, rough and hopeful. He would see Jack running. He would see Abigail watching John with cautious belief. He would see Uncle pretending to supervise. He might refuse to come inside because men like him bring weather with them. John would argue. Arthur would deflect. Maybe he leaves before supper. Maybe he places a small amount of money somewhere Abigail will find it. Maybe he sketches the house later in his journal and writes almost nothing beneath it. That silence would say enough. Thematically, Arthur leading the gang turns Red Dead Redemption 2 from a story about awakening inside collapse into a story about managing collapse once awake. In the original, Arthur spends much of the journey discovering that Dutch is failing. In this version, he discovers something more difficult. Knowing the truth does not make saving people simple. He has to plan, disappoint, discipline, deceive enemies, confront family, and accept partial victories. Redemption becomes administrative as much as spiritual. That sounds plain, but it is profound. Most real rescues are not grand moments. They are logistics guided by love. That is why this version can be extremely powerful without betraying the tone of the original. Arthur does not become king. He becomes responsible. He does not defeat modernity. He stops confusing resistance with self-destruction. He does not purify the gang. He gives its people exits. He does not erase Dutch's importance. He finally places Dutch's importance in the past where it belongs. He does not escape guilt. He uses guilt as pressure to do less harm before the end. The beauty is not that Arthur becomes perfect. The beauty is that he becomes useful in the deepest possible way. There is also a small but important difference in how Arthur would handle blame. Dutch pushes blame outward until the world becomes a conspiracy against his self-image. The law, the rich, the doubters, the traitors, the weak, the faithless, the frightened. All of them become pieces of an explanation where Dutch remains necessary. Arthur, for all his roughness, is more capable of letting blame cut inward. He may hate it. He may curse, deny, and brood before accepting it. But once he knows he has harmed someone, the knowledge stays. A leader who can be wounded by guilt is dangerous in one way, because guilt can make him reckless. But he is also capable of correction. Dutch's shame becomes performance. Arthur's shame can become change. That would alter the way the camp talks after mistakes. Under Dutch, a failed job often becomes a test of belief. Under Arthur, a failed job would more likely become a brutal post-mortem by the fire. Who saw the law first? Who fired too early? Who picked the wrong road? Who brought too much attention in town? Who drank before watch? This would be uncomfortable, and some would hate it because it strips failure of romance. But it would also make the gang smarter. Outlaws survive by learning faster than the people hunting them. Dutch increasingly wants the emotional reward of being trusted after failure. Arthur would want the failure understood before anyone sleeps. The quietest improvement might be the camp's relationship with truth. Arthur lies constantly to enemies, but inside the family he values plain speech more than Dutch does. He may not always tell the whole truth about his fear or illness, yet he has less need to wrap bad news in paradise. If money is low, people should know. If a town is too hot, people should know. If someone has to leave for their own safety, people should know. That kind of honesty can hurt morale in the short term, but false hope is more expensive later. Dutch keeps people warm with promises until the promises burn them. Arthur would rather hand them a cold fact and a blanket. Seen from far away then, Arthur's leadership would be less like a revolution and more like a long act of triage. He would decide which dreams can be saved, which wounds can be treated, which fights must be avoided, and which losses have to be accepted before they multiply. That is why the idea fits him so well. Arthur is not naturally hopeful, but he is deeply responsive to need. Put a hungry camp in front of him, and he hunts. Put a missing man in the snow, and he rides. Put a child in danger, and he moves. Put a dying dream in front of him, and perhaps, after enough pain, he finally stops trying to keep the dream alive and starts carrying the people out of it. The most peaceful image of this alternate story is not Arthur on a throne, because he would hate that. It is Arthur standing at the edge of a nearly empty camp near dawn. The wagons are gone, the women and children are gone, the younger ones who could still choose another life are gone. The loud dream has thinned into hoofprints. Hosea's old coat is folded somewhere. Dutch's tent is empty or abandoned. The stew pot is cold. Arthur has not won. The gang as a single living thing is over. But out there, in different directions, people are breathing because he let it end. That is leadership in the key of Red Dead. Not saving the dream, but saving the people from the dream. So if Arthur Morgan led the Van der Linde gang, the story would not become a clean victory. It would become a quieter tragedy with more survivors. Blackwater would still wound them. The law would still close in. Dutch would still struggle against being replaced. Micah would still hunt for cracks. The world would still modernise and the outlaw age would still die. But the gang's collapse would stop being a bonfire fed by Dutch's pride and become something more like a controlled burn. Painful, smoky, imperfect, but meant to keep the whole forest from going up. Arthur could not save the old life. He might save more people from dying inside it. That may be the deepest answer to the question. Arthur as leader would change the gang because he would eventually understand that the gang was never the dream. The people were. Dutch confused the two. He thought preserving the gang meant preserving the family, but by the end, the gang as an institution was killing the family as human beings. Arthur's best leadership would be the courage to separate them. Let the name die. Let the camp disappear. Let the songs become memory. Let the people live if they still can. That is not the ending Dutch wanted. It is the ending Arthur, after enough pain, might have been brave enough to choose. And now the fire can settle lower. The horses are quiet beyond the trees. The last cup of coffee has gone cold, and the road splits into all those softer possibilities. Somewhere, John rides with Abigail and Jack before the law can find the shape of their future. Somewhere, Sadie keeps watch with grief sharpened but not wasted. Somewhere, Charles leads people through dark country towards safer ground. Somewhere, Hosea's old wisdom lingers in the choices that did not become disasters. And Arthur, whether dying beneath a pale sunrise or living under a name no one remembers, has done the one thing he was always moving toward. He has turned loyalty away from the dream and back toward the living. Let that thought rest for a while. The camp is fading, but the people are still moving, and for tonight that is enough.